This is Christopher Clark, the Town Administrator, Town of Harwich. Here today to talk about different common concepts and terms that we use that I hopefully can make a little bit more explainable during the time of the year in which we're doing budgets or have fiscal issues. A lot of times municipal officials will use certain terms that may not have a direct relationship to your common terminology during your normal life. A lot of times people refer to Proposition 2.5. Proposition 2.5 was a ballot initiative that was passed in the early 1980s. And what Proposition 2.5 does is it limits the ability for towns, cities and towns in Massachusetts to raise the property tax. As Proposition 2.5 alludes to, it actually limits the amount that taxes can be raised in terms of the amount of dollars collected by 2.5% over the previous year. So it creates a cap. Now that cap it does move. There are a few items that do move the cap. One of the items that happens pretty much every year is a concept called new growth. And what new growth is that as if you have a plot of land that's vacant and a house goes up on it, now that's considered new growth, and that new growth is captured during a certain time of the year in which we set the valuations. So where 1 year before it was valued as a raw piece of land, and then the next year it's valued as a raw piece of land with a house on it, that additional value is called new growth. So that adds to the property tax base, and that adds to, so the next year we get the 2.5 plus the new growth adds, so that base moves through different elements. There are also three functional ways in which Proposition 2.5 can go over. A town can propose a budget that goes over. The most, probably not the most commonly used, but one of the ones that is used is called a general override. What a general override does is if you have that tax base and you have the 2.5% built, but that's insufficient money to operate the budget in the town effectively, then the Board of Selectmen, who only the Board of Selectmen can put these ballot questions on, for overrides, that the override would allow for, let's just use we'll make the math easy. If we have 2.5 but we need an additional 2%, then the override election would be called, placed on the ballot, and if the voters approve it, now in that 1 year, that 2.5 is added by the 2. If the override is passed successfully, for that year it's 4.5, and then that becomes part of a new base, and the new base gets added each year by the 2.5. So that's a general override is probably most noted because of its permanence. It's a permanent increase to the tax base, the valuation base. On the next two items are generally related to capital improvements. The first one is called a debt exclusion. Very similar to your home mortgage, that if you build your home and then have a mortgage payment, the debt exclusion allows for the same thing. And it's the value of that mortgage payment for that year that gets added to the tax base. So if in our case we built a new school, the new school, Monomoy School, that was done as a debt exclusion, so therefore the annual payments to pay the debt service on that is added into the tax base. The other one, so in that case, just to finish that thought, if the school debt was for 20 years, then for 20 consecutive years the debt service would be added to the tax base. At the end of the 20 years, then that falls off. It no longer gets added in. The other one that is related to capital is called capital outlay expenditures. This town, Harwich, has used that for purchasing ambulances, purchasing equipment, and the intent of the capital improvement is you take the capital item, whether it's an ambulance or a fire truck, and you finance that over 1 year. So it's a 1 year increase to the tax base. So you basically have Prop 2.5 limits how much you can raise, and there's 3 vehicles to go on top of that limit. Some of the other terms that I think that we generally use, you'll hear, one term is called free cash. Free cash is really kind of a real misnomer because there's no such thing really as free cash. The way it works is a town in the development of its budget picks a revenue estimate, and budgeting, municipal budgeting, is really about estimating and trying to project into the future what we think things will happen. So you project what you think the revenues will be for that year. You try to project conservatively, so you make sure you have sufficient funds to cover your budget. And then the second component is the budget itself. And you allocate X amount of dollars for the budget, and as the course of the year goes, you hope that you don't spend it all. So let's say, for instance, we only spend 95%. What happens is the fiscal year starts July 1 and ends June 30th. So they have basically hard dates in which that fiscal year occurs. After June 30th, there's a reconciliation that occurs. We look at our revenue. If our revenue was over by 500,000 and our expenses were under by 500,000, then we would have what's sometimes referred to as excess and deficiency, in the private sector sometimes referred to as retained earnings, that we would have a retained earnings or excess and deficiency amount of $1 million in that example. The state of Massachusetts actually calls that term free cash, so they have a term for it. But it really is the amount that's reconciled at the end of a fiscal year. The other term that I think is kind of a interesting term is the term cherry sheet. Now, I believe that the term has come about, hopefully this isn't urban legend, hopefully there's some accuracy to it, but the state of Massachusetts issues a amount of aid that they give to cities and towns. A large amount of this money for the revenue we receive is Chapter 70, which is for educational assistance to cities and towns. The other one, they've changed the name of it, but it's basically lottery money. The money that's generated by the Massachusetts State Lottery comes back to cities and towns in the form of actual cash allocation. The town can use those monies. The lottery money is unrestricted, can be used against any expense for the town. And on the Chapter 70, that is money that's more dedicated for education purposes. So the amount of money that the town receives from the state, it comes out on a form, and the history of it is that originally the state used to issue it on pink paper and or cherry-colored paper. So the local vernacular back when they did that was they called them cherry sheets. And that name has really stuck and is used today even for the state's allocation. Now the state's cherry sheet has 2 components. The primary component, as I've already alluded to, was on the revenue side to tell a city and town how much revenue it had. It also has some expenditures that the state renders some services to cities and towns, and they charge us for those services. Certainly if county government exists or if we have a regional transit authority, those assessments are included in the cherry sheet materials. So a cherry sheet is basically the state aid that we receive and the state charges that we receive. A couple other terms just to kind of cover. Sometimes you'll hear that the town has a stabilization fund. So how does the town utilize that stabilization fund? During a course of a year, the town can actively budget and plan to add money into, if you would, a rainy day account is probably another term for stabilization fund. That's money that doesn't have an allocated purpose for it. So we put that money aside to kind of save up in case we have a more major situation. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch do encourage cities and towns to put money aside in order to address difficult times. I think this year we've had a lot of snow, so having a stabilization fund to be able to fund some of those overages that are unforeseen is a good tool to have in order to address that type of concern. So a town will put aside some of that money, either plan for putting it aside within the tax base or utilize some of the money that we may find that we have from other reserves, like such as free cash, and put it into stabilization. So we try to grow the stabilization to help to get through difficult times. There is also, the town does have kind of a emergency fund that it calls a reserve fund. The reserve fund is something that is budgeted each year. It's under the control of the Finance Committee, and as the town has a urgent need or an unforeseen need that comes up that needs to be addressed during the course of the year, we don't have to wait to go to town meeting to access that money, such as you would have to in the case of a stabilization fund. You can go to the reserve fund to generate some additional resources in order to meet any needs that come up. In our case, the reserve fund is around $125,000, which on a $55 million budget really is not that much money, so we try to get the budgeting as accurate as we can. But in certain circumstances, we'll run into, excuse me, we'll run into some of those expenses that weren't anticipated, and then that gives us a resource. A lot of times it will be things such as having an accident or having a vehicle get damaged that needs to be replaced. Sometimes a police cruiser may need to be replaced that wasn't anticipated because of an accident, and where insurance may not cover the full amount, then you could go to the reserve fund. Certainly the reserve fund too, in a situation where we have a heavy winter with a lot of snow, that may play a role in assisting in some of the snow overages. On the since I have snow, and you can probably see the snow in the over my shoulder out the window, that we do have for snow and ice. There's a special statute that allows a town during the course of a harsh winter to be able to overexpend and run a temporary deficit, if you would, so we can get the streets cleared, and then the town has to fund that. In this year's budget, just as an example, we took some of the money for free cash, which I've alluded to earlier, the leftover money from the previous year, that we took some of that allocation of free cash and we put it towards the snow and ice. So we have a good portion of the snow and ice deficit covered through the careful allocation of our funds that are available to us, such as free cash. Well, hopefully I didn't bore you too much with the different terms, but I know that as in any specialized field, there's a lot of terms that people hear that they're not totally familiar with. Again, not something you use in your everyday vernacular. So hopefully this kind of helps. So if you do watch a selectmen's meetings or other shows on our local cable channel and you hear some of these terms mentioned, hopefully I've been able to put some of those terms into context for you. So I just wish to thank you again for your time and attention, and we'll see you on the next show.